Hello there, and welcome back to Real Conflict Zone. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Whether you're listening during your morning commute, taking a break from work, or settling in for the night, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome to the community. We explore stories of survival, mystery, and the extraordinary things ordinary people experience when reality itself seems to shift beneath their feet. If you find yourself drawn into what you're about to hear, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, your support means everything. Now, let's get into tonight's story, and I promise you, this one will keep you questioning everything until the very last word. Every night, one of them gets closer. This is the story of 8 people who went camping in a forest that shouldn't exist, under a sky that defied every law of physics they thought they understood, and the terrifying discovery that some reflections show you not what is, but what's coming. This is the story of the forest with 2 moons, and what happened when those moons began to move. The Cascade National Forest stretched across 200,000 acres of dense woodland in the Pacific Northwest, a vast expanse of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had stood for centuries, silent witnesses to the passage of time and the changing of seasons. It was the kind of forest that appeared in guidebooks and travel magazines, celebrated for its hiking trails and pristine camping sites, for the way morning mist clung to the valleys and how sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden columns that looked almost divine. Every year, thousands of people visited the forest, pitched their tents beneath those ancient trees, and returned home with photographs and memories of a perfect wilderness experience. But there were parts of the Cascade National Forest that didn't appear in guidebooks, areas that rangers quietly discouraged visitors from exploring, sections of the map where trails seemed to dead end for no apparent reason and where the Forest Service had never quite gotten around to installing proper signage. These were the deep places, the old places, where the trees grew so thick that even at noon the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight, where creeks ran in directions that didn't quite match the topographical maps, and where experienced hikers sometimes reported feeling watched by something they could never quite identify. Sarah Chan had been planning this camping trip for 6 months, ever since her divorce had been finalized, and she decided that what she needed more than therapy or a rebound relationship was to reconnect with nature. To remember who she was before marriage and mortgage payments and the slow erosion of dreams had turned her into someone she barely recognized. She was 34 years old, a software engineer who spent 60 hours a week staring at computer screens, and the last time she'd been camping had been in college, back when adventure had seemed like something to pursue rather than something to avoid. She'd posted about the trip on social media, half expecting no one to respond, but to her surprise, 7 other people had jumped at the opportunity. Some were friends from college she'd lost touch with over the years, others were friends of friends, people she'd met once or twice at parties and connected with online. It was the kind of group that forms around shared nostalgia and the vague hope that recreating past experiences might somehow recapture past feelings. There was Marcus Webb, Sarah's college roommate's boyfriend from sophomore year, now a high school history teacher with a failed engagement behind him and a collection of hiking gear that suggested he'd been trying to walk away from his problems for years. He was 36, soft-spoken, with the kind of sad eyes that made people want to comfort him even before they knew what he was sad about. Marcus had suggested they go deep into the forest, away from the designated camping areas where families with RVs clustered around fire pits and generators hummed through the night. He wanted authentic wilderness, he'd said, the kind of place where you could spend 3 days without seeing another human being. Jennifer Cole and Michael Torres were a couple, though whether they were a happy couple was something their friends debated when they weren't around. Jennifer was 32. A nurse who worked overnight shifts at a trauma center and had the kind of dark humor that came from seeing too much suffering. Michael was 35, an accountant who approached life with the same methodical precision he brought to spreadsheets, always planning, always calculating, always trying to control variables that couldn't be controlled. They'd been together for 4 years, and their relationship had settled into that comfortable stasis where neither person was quite satisfied but both were too invested to walk away. David Kim was the youngest of the group at 28, a graduate student in astrophysics who spent his days studying stellar phenomena and his nights wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake choosing academia over the software engineering job that would have paid 3 times his stipend. He'd brought camping gear that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, high-tech and expensive and completely unnecessary for a simple weekend in the woods. David had a habit of explaining things in excessive detail, of turning casual observations into lectures, and while the others found it endearing in small doses, they'd learned to change the subject before he could really get going. Lisa Rodriguez was 33, a freelance photographer who'd spent the last 5 years traveling the world on assignment, documenting conflicts and disasters and the resilient faces of people who'd survived both. She'd returned to the States 6 months ago after a particularly rough assignment in Syria had left her with PTSD and a conviction that she needed to rediscover beauty in the world, to remember that not everything was war and suffering. She brought more camera equipment than camping gear, and she'd made everyone promise they'd let her photograph the trip extensively for a project she was developing about reconnection and healing. Robert Santos was 41, the oldest of the group, a divorced father of 2 who had his kids every other weekend and spent the other weekends trying to figure out who he was when he wasn't being dad. He owned a construction company that was doing well enough to pay his alimony and child support with enough left over for toys he didn't need and trips he hoped would give his life meaning beyond work and parental obligations. Robert had been a Marine 20 years ago, had done 2 tours in Iraq, and while he never talked about it much, there were moments when something in his expression suggested he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. And finally, there was Amanda Foster, 30 years old, a social worker who spent her days dealing with the worst of human nature and her nights trying to convince herself that people were fundamentally good despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She'd been Sarah's best friend in college, the person who talked her through breakups and bad grades and the various crises that felt world-ending at 20 but seemed almost quaint in retrospect. Amanda had suggested they do a digital detox for the trip, leave their phones in the car, disconnect from the constant stream of news and social media and other people's curated lives. Everyone had agreed, though most had been secretly relieved when Marcus pointed out they should keep one phone for emergencies, and it had been decided that Robert, as the only one with actual wilderness survival training, would carry the emergency phone. They met at Sarah's apartment on a Friday afternoon in late September, loading gear into Robert's pickup truck and Marcus's SUV, and the excitement in the air was palpable, the kind of nervous energy that comes from breaking routine and stepping outside the comfortable boundaries of ordinary life. They'd planned to drive 3 hours to the forest, set up camp before dark, and spend the weekend hiking, talking around the campfire, and pretending they were the kind of people who did this sort of thing regularly. The drive started well enough, everyone in good spirits, sharing stories and laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, but felt hilarious in the moment. They stopped for lunch at a diner off the highway, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and pie that was advertised as homemade even though everyone knew it came from a distributor. The waitress was friendly in that professional small-town way, and when Marcus mentioned they were heading to Cascade National Forest, she paused in the middle of pouring coffee and asked which area they were planning to camp in. Marcus told her about the coordinates he'd found, a remote section of the forest where satellite images showed a clearing near a creek, far from any established trails or camping sites. The waitress's expression changed slightly, something flickering across her face that might have been concern or might have been nothing at all. She said they should stick to the marked trails, that the deep forest could be disorienting, that people sometimes got lost out there. Marcus thanked her for the advice with the kind of polite dismissiveness that made it clear he wasn't going to follow it. And the waitress didn't push the issue, just topped off their coffee and moved on to the next table. They reached the forest by late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ranger station at the forest entrance was closed, a handwritten sign on the door apologizing for the inconvenience and directing visitors to self-register at the trailhead kiosks. Marcus filled out the registration form, carefully noting their planned route and expected return date, and they drove deeper into the forest on roads that grew progressively narrower and more rutted. The last 5 miles were on a logging road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, the truck and SUV bouncing over potholes and rocks while branches scraped against the sides. The forest pressed in close on both sides, the trees so dense that it felt like driving through a tunnel, and more than once someone wondered aloud if they should turn back, if maybe they'd made a wrong turn somewhere. But Marcus insisted they were going the right way, his GPS app showing they were getting closer to the coordinates he'd marked, and eventually the logging road opened into a clearing exactly where he'd predicted. The clearing was perfect, almost suspiciously so. It was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, with level ground that looked ideal for pitching tents. A creek ran along one edge, the water clear and cold and moving fast enough to suggest it would be safe to drink after filtering. The trees that surrounded the clearing were massive, old-growth forest that must have been standing for centuries. Their trunks so thick it would take 3 people holding hands to circle them. The late afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, creating those golden columns of light that made everything look magical, ethereal, like something from a fantasy painting. They unloaded the vehicles and set up camp with the efficient coordination of people who'd watched enough YouTube videos to feel competent. The tents went up easily, 3 two-person tents arranged in a rough semicircle around what would be their fire pit. Robert and David gathered rocks to line the pit while Marcus and Michael collected firewood from the edge of the clearing. The women set up the cooking area, organizing food supplies and hanging bear bags from branches the way the internet had taught them. By the time everything was set up, the sun had nearly touched the horizon, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. September in the Pacific Northwest meant cold nights even after warm days, and everyone pulled on jackets and fleeces as they gathered around the fire that Robert had expertly constructed and lit. The flames caught quickly, crackling and popping as the dry wood ignited, and smoke rose in a column that dissipated somewhere above them in the darkening sky. They cooked dinner over the fire, a simple meal of grilled vegetables and chicken that tasted better than it had any right to simply because they were eating it outdoors, because the air was clean and the company was good, and there was something primal and satisfying about gathering around fire and sharing food. Conversation flowed easily, helped along by the wine that Jennifer had brought and the beer that Robert had packed in a cooler. They talked about work and relationships, about dreams they'd had and dreams they'd abandoned, about the strange trajectory of life that had taken them from college students with infinite potential to adults with mortgages and responsibilities, and the creeping suspicion that they'd somehow missed the point somewhere along the way. David, who'd been relatively quiet during dinner, suddenly pointed up at the sky and said something that made everyone stop talking and look up. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening blue above them. But what David was pointing at wasn't stars. It was the moon, full and bright, hanging low over the eastern horizon. Except there were 2 of them. At first, everyone thought it was a joke, that David was messing with them or they'd had more wine than they realized. But as they stared up at the sky, as their eyes adjusted to the darkness and the stars grew brighter, there was no denying what they were seeing. 2 moons hung in the sky above them, both full, both bright, separated by maybe 20 degrees of arc. They were identical in size, identical in appearance, the same craters and Maria visible on both, the same pale light reflecting down onto the forest below. Michael was the first to speak, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from his accountant's brain trying to process something that didn't fit any logical framework. He said this wasn't possible, that there was only one moon, that whatever they were seeing had to be an illusion or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. David agreed, sort of saying that there were things that could create the appearance of multiple moons, light refraction through ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, but that those were usually just halos or arcs, not complete duplicate images. Lisa had already grabbed her camera, was adjusting settings and taking photographs, and when she looked at the digital display, both moons were clearly visible in the frame. She showed the others, and seeing the 2 moons captured in a photograph somehow made them more real, more undeniable. Sarah suggested they were seeing the moon and its reflection somehow, but Amanda pointed out that you couldn't see a reflection in the sky, that reflections required a surface, water or glass or something that could mirror an image. They stood there for maybe 10 minutes, all 8 of them staring up at the impossible sky, trying to come up with explanations that made sense, that fit within the rational universe they thought they understood. Marcus wondered if they were all experiencing some kind of shared hallucination, if maybe there'd been something in the water they'd filtered from the creek. Jennifer, with her medical training, pointed out that mass hallucinations didn't work that way, that they couldn't all be seeing the exact same thing in such precise detail. Robert finally broke the strange paralysis that had settled over the group. He said they should check the reflection in the creek, see if both moons appeared in the water. It was something to do, some kind of test that might provide data to help them understand what they were experiencing. They walked together to the edge of the clearing where the creek ran, and Marcus pulled out a flashlight to illuminate the water's surface. The creek was about 10 feet wide at this point, running fast and clear over smooth stones, and its surface reflected the sky above with near-perfect clarity. They could see stars, could see the trees silhouetted against the sky, could see both moons hanging there in the reflected firmament. Except when Sarah knelt down to look more closely, when she really focused on the reflection, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. One of the moons reflected perfectly, every crater and feature mirrored exactly in the water. But the other moon, the one that hung slightly to the north of the first, didn't reflect at all. Where it should have appeared in the water, there was only empty sky, only the darkness of space and the distant stars. It was as if the water could see one moon but not the other, as if one of them existed in a way that the other didn't. Sarah called the others over, showed them what she'd discovered, and they took turns kneeling at the creek's edge, verifying what she'd seen. David pulled out his phone despite their digital detox agreement, trying to get a signal to search for information or call someone who might explain what they were experiencing. But there were no bars, no connection to the outside world. Robert tried the emergency phone he'd been carrying, but it showed the same thing. No service, even though they were only a few miles from the logging road where they definitely had signal earlier. The group returned to the fire, but the easy camaraderie of dinner had been replaced by tension and unease. Amanda tried to laugh it off, suggested they were just tired from the drive and seeing things, that everything would make sense in the morning. But no one really believed that, and the way people kept glancing up at the sky, at those two moons that shouldn't exist, made it clear that whatever was happening, it wasn't going away. They stayed up late that first night, feeding the fire and talking in circles, trying to rationalize the impossible, proposing and discarding theories that ranged from scientific to supernatural. Michael suggested they were near a military base conducting some kind of experimental technology, though he couldn't explain how that would create the appearance of two moons. Jennifer wondered if they were experiencing some localized phenomenon, a pocket of altered reality caused by geological factors or unusual magnetic fields. Lisa, who'd covered enough strange events in her journalism career to have a more open mind about the unexplainable, suggested they might want to consider the possibility that they were simply in a place where the normal rules didn't apply. Robert, drawing on his military experience, proposed they organize a watch schedule, have someone stay up through the night to monitor the situation and wake the others if anything changed. It was the kind of practical suggestion that gave everyone something to focus on, a way to impose order on chaos. They agreed to 2-hour shifts, and Robert volunteered to take the first watch while the others tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Sarah lay in her tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around them, the rustle of wind through branches, the distant call of an owl, the crackling of the fire where Robert sat keeping watch. She kept thinking about those two moons, about the one that didn't reflect in the water, and the more she thought about it, the more disturbed she became. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that violated not just physics but some fundamental sense of how reality should work. Around 2 in the morning, during Marcus's watch shift, he woke everyone up. His voice was urgent but controlled, and when they emerged from their tents, pulling on jackets against the cold, he pointed at the sky. The two moons had moved, which was normal, the Earth's rotation carrying them across the celestial sphere the way the moon always moved. But they'd moved at different rates. The moon that reflected in the water had traced the normal arc across the sky, following the predictable path that astronomers could calculate with precision. The other moon, the one without a reflection, had moved less far, lagging behind the first, and the gap between them had grown from 20 degrees to maybe 30. David immediately pulled out a notebook and started making calculations, trying to work out the math of what they were seeing. If both moons were following orbital mechanics, he explained, they should move at the same rate relative to the Earth's surface. The fact that they weren't suggested that one of them wasn't following normal physics, wasn't bound by gravity and motion the way celestial objects were supposed to be. Lisa photographed the new positions, marking the time in her camera's metadata, creating a record of something that shouldn't exist. They stayed up the rest of the night, watching the sky, and by dawn, the disparity had grown even more pronounced. The reflecting moon had traveled its full arc across the sky and was setting in the west, its light fading as the sun began to rise in the east. But the non-reflecting moon had barely moved, hanging in roughly the same position it had occupied when they'd first noticed it, as if it were somehow independent of the Earth's rotation, as if it were fixed to a different set of coordinates that had nothing to do with planetary mechanics. As morning light filled the clearing, Both moons faded from view, though whether they'd actually disappeared or were simply lost in the brightness of day, no one could say. The group gathered around the fire pit, exhausted and on edge, and had the conversation they'd been avoiding all night. Should they pack up and leave, head back to civilization where physics worked the way it was supposed to and the sky held only one moon? Michael advocated strongly for leaving, pointing out that they were experiencing something that defied explanation, that could potentially be dangerous, that they had no way to understand or control. Jennifer agreed with him, her nurse's instincts telling her that when you encountered something this fundamentally wrong, the smart move was to extract yourself from the situation. But Sarah found herself wanting to stay, driven by the same curiosity that had made her good at debugging code, the need to understand how things worked, to figure out the logic behind what seemed illogical. Marcus sided with Sarah, arguing that they'd planned this trip for months, that they were perfectly safe so far, that all that had happened was they'd witnessed an astronomical anomaly that, while strange, hadn't actually threatened them in any way. David wanted to stay for scientific reasons, saying this was potentially the most important astronomical observation in human history, that they had a responsibility to document it and gather as much data as possible. Lisa wanted to stay because she wanted to photograph it, because her artist's eye saw something profound and beautiful in those two moons, something that transcended mere physics. In the end, they took a vote, and it was 5-3 in favor of staying at least one more night. Michael and Jennifer were unhappy with the decision but went along with the majority. Amanda, who'd cast the deciding vote to stay, said she was curious to see if the phenomenon repeated itself tonight, if the two moons would appear again or if last night had been a one-time event caused by atmospheric conditions they didn't understand. They spent the day trying to act normal, hiking through the forest around the clearing, cooking meals over the fire, taking photographs and making conversation that carefully avoided the topic of what they'd seen. But the tension was there beneath the surface, and everyone kept checking their phones even though they knew there was no signal, kept glancing at the sky even though the moons weren't visible in daylight, kept wondering what they'd see when night fell again. The forest itself seemed different in daylight than it had seemed when they'd arrived. The trees were more oppressive somehow, their trunks massive and dark, their branches creating a canopy so dense that even at noon the forest floor remained in shadow. When they hiked more than a few hundred yards from the clearing, the forest seemed to close in around them, trails that should have been easy to follow becoming confused and indistinct, landmarks they thought they'd noted disappearing or appearing in places they shouldn't be. Robert, who had extensive wilderness experience, kept getting turned around, finding himself leading the group in circles despite having a compass and GPS. The compass worked fine, pointing reliably north, but north didn't seem to mean what it should mean. Trails that ran east-west according to the compass somehow looped back on themselves in ways that defied topography. They'd set out on what should have been a simple 3-mile loop around the clearing, but after 2 hours of hiking, they'd ended up back where they started without completing the loop, as if the forest had gently but firmly guided them back to the clearing against their intentions. By late afternoon, everyone was back at camp, and the earlier confidence that had led them to vote to stay was beginning to waver. There was something wrong with this place, something beyond the astronomical impossibility they'd witnessed the night before. The forest didn't feel right, didn't follow the rules of normal geography, and the longer they stayed here, the more they felt like they were guests in a place that operated according to logic they couldn't comprehend. As the sun began to set on their second night in the forest, they gathered again around the fire pit. But this time there was no wine, no beer, no casual conversation. Everyone was tense, watching the sky, waiting to see if the two moons would appear again or if last night had been some kind of anomaly, a one-time glitch in the fabric of reality that would never repeat itself. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, and as twilight deepened to dusk, the first moon rose in the east. It was full again or still full, and for a moment there was hope that this night would be different, that they'd see only one moon, that last night had been an aberration. But as the sky darkened further and stars began to appear, the second moon rose as well, following perhaps 20 minutes behind the first, and now there could be no doubt, no rationalization, no way to explain this away as a trick of light or atmospheric conditions. Sarah walked to the creek immediately, needing to verify what she'd observed the night before, and the others followed. The water's surface reflected the first moon perfectly, every detail clear and sharp. The second moon, rising now in the eastern sky, cast no reflection at all, the water showing only darkness where its image should have been. But there was something else. Something new that made Sarah's skin prickle with instinctive dread. The second moon, the non-reflecting one, was closer than it had been the night before. Not dramatically closer, but measurably so, its apparent size in the sky perhaps 5 or 10% larger than it had been when they'd first seen it. David confirmed this with measurements and calculations, using a sextant app on his phone and comparing the moon's apparent diameter to reference points they'd marked the previous night. If the moon was getting closer, David explained with barely controlled panic in his voice, and if it was moving independently of normal orbital mechanics, then there was no way to predict what would happen next, how close it might come, or what effects it might have. A body the size of the moon approaching Earth would cause tidal forces, would disrupt weather patterns, would potentially be catastrophic on a global scale. But they weren't experiencing any of those effects. No unusual tides in the creek, no strange weather, nothing but the visual impossibility of two moons in the sky and one of them getting gradually closer. Marcus suggested they document everything, create a detailed record of what they were observing so that if they made it back to civilization, they'd have evidence that this wasn't mass delusion or some kind of shared psychotic break. Lisa photographed the sky extensively, taking long exposures that captured both moons, and David took measurements and made calculations, filling pages of his notebook with figures and observations. Around midnight, Amanda was the first to notice the second thing that was wrong. She'd been walking around the clearing, unable to sleep, too anxious to sit still, when she realized she was counting her steps unconsciously, the way she sometimes did when she was nervous. 1, 2, 3, for walking toward the creek. And then she looked up at the non-reflecting moon and realized with a jolt of pure terror that it had moved. Not in its arc across the sky, not following celestial mechanics, but closer. Measurably, visibly closer than it had been when she'd started walking. She called the others over, told them what she'd observed, and they tested it. Robert walked 50 paces toward the edge of the clearing, counting out loud, and everyone watched the second moon. And as he walked, as his footsteps carried him away from the center of the clearing, the non-reflecting moon grew larger, closer, as if it were matching his pace, as if it were somehow connected to their movements through space. They tested it again and again, trying to establish the pattern, and the results were consistent and terrifying. When any of them walked, the second moon moved closer. When they stood still, it stopped moving. The distance it traveled seemed roughly proportional to the distance they walked, though the ratio wasn't exact and seemed to vary depending on direction. Walking toward the east, toward the moon itself, seemed to bring it closer faster than walking in other directions. Michael, who'd been advocating to leave since the previous night, now insisted they pack up immediately, that they needed to get out of this forest and back to civilization right now, tonight, regardless of the danger of hiking in the dark. He started breaking down his tent, and Jennifer helped him, both of them moving with barely controlled panic. But Sarah stopped them, pointed out that if the moon moved closer when they walked, then hiking out would mean walking several miles, which would bring the moon much, much closer than it was now. The group stood frozen in terrible indecision. Staying seemed dangerous, but leaving seemed more dangerous, and they had no framework for understanding what they were dealing with, no basis for making an informed choice. David suggested they minimize movement, stay as still as possible, wait until dawn and hope that whatever was happening only occurred at night. It was thin logic, but it was better than nothing, and everyone except Michael agreed. They spent the rest of the night sitting absolutely still around the dying fire, watching the non-reflecting moon hang in the sky above them, fighting the urge to pace or fidget or do any of the unconscious movements that people do when they're nervous and frightened. Every time someone shifted position, every time someone had to stand up to use the latrine at the edge of the clearing, they'd watch the moon and swear they could see it grow infinitesimally larger, could see it matching their movements, pacing them like some cosmic predator. Dawn came eventually, as it always does, and with the sunrise, both moons faded from view. The group was exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear, and the conversation they'd avoided all night finally happened in the harsh light of morning. They needed to leave, needed to get out of this forest immediately, and they needed to do it in a way that minimized walking distance. Michael suggested they take the vehicles, drive out the way they'd driven in, and while that would still involve movement, it would be faster and cover more ground in less time than hiking. Everyone agreed, and they began breaking camp with frantic efficiency, throwing gear into bags without bothering to organize it, pulling down tents and stuffing them into their bags still damp with dew. Within 30 minutes, they were loaded into the vehicles, Robert's truck leading with 4 people, Marcus's SUV following with the other 4. Robert started the engine, put the truck in gear, and began driving toward the logging road that had brought them to this clearing. They made it perhaps 100 yards before Robert slammed on the brakes, and Marcus barely avoided rear-ending him. In front of them, where the logging road should have been, where they'd driven just 2 days earlier, there was only forest. Dense, impenetrable forest, trees so close together that there were no gaps between their trunks, branches interlaced in a wall of vegetation that looked like it had been there for centuries. Robert backed up, tried a different angle, but everywhere they turned, there was only forest. The logging road was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, and when they got out of the vehicles to investigate on foot, they found no trace of the path they'd taken to reach this clearing. No tire tracks in the dirt, no broken branches from where they'd scraped against the vehicles, no evidence that anyone had ever driven through this forest. They were trapped, cut off from the outside world, stuck in a clearing where the laws of physics didn't apply and 2 moons hung in the sky and one of them was getting closer every time they moved. The panic that everyone had been suppressing for 2 days finally broke through. Jennifer started crying, demanding to know what was happening, why this was happening to them. Michael started hyperventilating, and Amanda had to talk him through breathing exercises to keep him from passing out. Sarah found herself moving into a strange kind of calm, the same mindset she used when debugging particularly complex code, when she needed to think clearly and logically despite pressure and confusion. She gathered everyone together and proposed they approach this systematically, treat it like a problem to be solved rather than a disaster to panic about. They needed to understand the rules of whatever they were dealing with, needed to figure out what was happening and why, because information was the only tool they had. David agreed, and together, they began organizing what they knew. The forest had changed, cutting off their exit. 2 moons appeared at night, one reflecting in water and one not. The non-reflecting moon moved closer when they walked, matching their movements in some proportional way they hadn't fully figured out yet. These were the facts, strange and terrifying, but facts nonetheless, and facts could be analyzed, patterns could be identified, and maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out of this. Lisa suggested she continue photographing everything, creating a visual record that might reveal patterns they weren't seeing with their naked eyes. David proposed they set up controlled experiments, walk measured distances in different directions and document the moon's response, try to establish the mathematical relationship between their movement and its movement. Robert, thinking tactically, suggested they inventory their supplies, figure out how long they could survive here if they couldn't find a way out. They spent the day working on these tasks, and what they discovered was both enlightening and deeply disturbing. The food they'd brought, which should have lasted them 3 days, hadn't diminished at all. The sandwiches they'd eaten for lunch yesterday were still in the coolers, uneaten. The wood they'd burned in the fire pit had reappeared at the edge of the clearing, the same branches in the same positions they'd been when they'd first collected them. It was as if time in the clearing was somehow circular, as if each day reset things to their initial state. Robert's emergency phone showed no passage of time either. According to the phone's internal clock, it was still Friday evening, still the moment when they'd first arrived at the clearing. But they'd definitely experienced 2 nights, had definitely slept and woken and lived through events that had taken time. The disconnect between experienced time and measured time was deeply disorienting, raising questions about what was real and what might be some kind of illusion or simulation. As the sun began to set on what they thought was their 3rd night in the forest, they gathered again to watch the moon's rise. The first moon appeared right on schedule, following its predictable arc across the eastern horizon. The second moon followed 20 minutes later, and when it rose, everyone could see immediately that it was closer than it had been the night before, perhaps 15 or 20% larger in apparent size. David took measurements and confirmed it. The moon's apparent diameter had increased significantly, more than could be explained by their movements during the previous night. The moon was approaching them even when they weren't moving, even when they were standing still. Their movements accelerated its approach, but it was coming regardless, drawn toward them or toward this place by forces they couldn't understand. David did some rough calculations and estimated that if the pattern held, if the moon continued approaching at this rate, it would reach the clearing within 4 or 5 more days. What would happen when it arrived, no one wanted to speculate. A body the size of the moon should have enormous gravitational effects, should tear the Earth apart with tidal forces long before it actually made contact. But this moon didn't seem to follow normal physics, didn't cast a reflection, didn't move through the sky the way celestial objects should. Maybe it would pass through them like a ghost, or maybe it would end everything when it arrived. There was no way to know, and the uncertainty was in many ways worse than any specific fate they could imagine. That night, they barely slept. Everyone was too frightened, too aware of the moon hanging above them, growing imperceptibly larger as the hours passed. They took turns watching it, documenting its slow approach, and in the pre-dawn hours before the sun rose, Robert made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been walking to the creek to filter more water, moving slowly and carefully to minimize the moon's approach, when he noticed something in the water's reflection. The first moon, the one that reflected normally, cast its usual perfect mirror image on the water's surface. But there was something else in the reflection, something that wasn't in the sky above. In the water below the reflected moon, there was an image of the clearing, of their camp, of all of them gathered around the fire pit. But in the reflection, they weren't alone. There were figures standing at the edge of the clearing, visible in the water's reflection but not present in the actual clearing when Robert turned to look. He called the others over, showed them what he was seeing, and everyone stared into the water's surface at the impossible image reflected there. In the reflection, there were at least a dozen figures surrounding the clearing, human-shaped but somehow wrong, their proportions slightly off, their movements too fluid or too jerky. Their presence there without being there deeply unsettling. Amanda suggested these might be some kind of echo, images from another time or another version of events bleeding through into their reality. David proposed they might be seeing into a parallel dimension, that the water somehow showed them a reflection not just of space but of alternate realities, places where different versions of events played out simultaneously. Lisa photographed the reflection extensively, capturing images of figures that existed only in the water's mirror world, entities that watched them from a realm adjacent to their own. Marcus made the connection first, his history teacher's mind drawing parallels to old folklore and mythology. He said that in many cultures, reflections were considered windows to other worlds, that water was seen as a boundary between the realm of the living and the realm of spirits or alternate dimensions. What if the two moons represented two different realities, and they were somehow caught between them? The reflecting moon belonged to their world, followed the laws of their physics, moved according to their understanding of how celestial mechanics worked. The non-reflecting moon belonged to somewhere else, somewhere that operated on different principles, and its approach wasn't just physical but dimensional. Sarah asked the obvious question. If the figures in the reflection were from another reality, what did they want? Why were they there, surrounding the clearing, watching through the boundary that the water's surface represented? Robert had been studying the reflected figures more closely, and he said something that made everyone's blood run cold. The figures weren't just watching them, they were mimicking them. Every movement the group made, every gesture, every shift in position, the figures in the reflection copied it, but with a delay, as if they were learning, studying, trying to understand how to move and act like the people they were observing. Jennifer suggested they try to communicate with the figures, see if they could establish some kind of contact or dialogue. David objected, pointing out that interacting with entities from another dimension when they had no understanding of what those entities were or what they wanted seemed potentially dangerous. But Lisa was already trying, kneeling at the creek's edge, waving at the reflected figures, trying to get their attention. The figures responded. When Lisa waved, one of the reflected entities waved back, but the movement was wrong, the gesture exaggerated and jerky, like someone who'd seen a wave performed but didn't quite understand the mechanics of it. Lisa tried other movements, and the figure copied them all, each repetition slightly more accurate than the last, as if it were learning through observation and practice. Amanda pointed out something else, something even more disturbing. When Lisa interacted with the reflected figures, the non-reflecting moon moved. Not closer this time, but across the sky, shifting position in a way that had nothing to do with orbital mechanics or the passage of time. It was as if the moon and the figures were connected, as if the moon was some kind of gateway or portal through which the figures were observing them, and when the barrier between worlds thinned enough to allow communication, the moon responded. David had his notebook out, was frantically making calculations and sketching diagrams, trying to work out the relationship between their movements, the moon's approach, and the figures in the reflection. He said that if his theory was correct, if the non-reflecting moon really was some kind of dimensional gateway, then its approach represented the thinning of the barrier between their reality and whatever reality the figures inhabited. Every step they took, every movement they made, generated some kind of energy or disturbance that weakened that barrier, brought the two realities closer together. When the moon finally reached them, when it made contact with their world, the barrier would collapse completely, and the two realities would merge or overlap or collide. What that would mean for them, for the Earth, for the fabric of reality itself, David couldn't predict. But it probably wouldn't be good, and it definitely wouldn't be reversible. Michael, who'd been silent since their failed escape attempt, finally spoke up. He said they needed to stop moving entirely, needed to minimize any disturbance that might accelerate the moon's approach. If movement brought the moon closer, then absolute stillness might slow it down, buy them time to figure out another solution. It made sense logically, but Sarah pointed out the practical problems. They needed water, needed to maintain the fire, needed to move around the camp for basic survival functions. Complete stillness wasn't sustainable. Robert proposed a compromise. They'd move as little as possible, coordinate their movements so that when someone did have to walk, everyone else remained absolutely still, minimizing the cumulative effect. They'd ration water to reduce trips to the creek, let the fire die down to conserve fuel, and reduce the need to collect more wood. It wasn't perfect, but it might buy them enough time to understand what was happening and find a way out. The fourth night brought new horrors. The non-reflecting moon rose earlier than it had the previous nights, appearing in the sky while the sun was still setting, visible even in daylight. It was massive now, perhaps twice the size it had been when they'd first seen it, dominating the eastern sky like some enormous pearl hanging in space. The reflected figures in the creek had multiplied as well, dozens of them now surrounding the clearing's reflection, all of them watching, all of them moving in that jerky, not quite right way that suggested they were learning, adapting, preparing for something. Lisa noticed another detail in her photographs. When she compared images from different nights, she could see that the reflected figures were becoming more defined, more solid-looking, as if they were gaining substance as the barrier between realities weakened. On the first night, they'd been barely visible, ghostly outlines that could have been tricks of light and shadow. Now they had features, faces that were almost but not quite human, bodies that existed in 3 dimensions rather than flat silhouettes. David's calculations suggested they had perhaps 2 more nights before the non-reflecting moon reached them, before whatever was going to happen would happen. The group sat around their carefully rationed fire and discussed options. But there weren't many left. They couldn't leave, the forest prevented that. They couldn't stop the moon's approach. Their existence alone seemed to draw it closer. They couldn't call for help. The phones had no signal and time itself seemed frozen at the moment of their arrival. Marcus suggested they try to understand the figure's intentions, see if there was a way to communicate beyond simple mimicry. Maybe the figures weren't hostile, maybe they were just curious, trying to understand the humans the same way the humans were trying to understand them. Amanda supported this idea, her social worker instincts telling her that fear and hostility would only make the situation worse, that maybe the path forward was through understanding rather than resistance. So they tried, taking turns, minimizing movement to keep the moon from advancing too rapidly. They approached the creek and attempted to communicate with the reflected figures. Sarah tried drawing symbols in the dirt near the water's edge, seeing if the figures would copy them or respond with their own symbols. Marcus tried speaking, asking questions, though he had no idea if the figures could hear or understand language. Lisa photographed everything, documenting each attempt at communication, looking for patterns in how the figures responded. Progress was slow and frustrating. The figures would copy some gestures but not others, would respond to certain symbols but ignore different ones, would sometimes initiate their own movements that seemed purposeful but whose meaning remained opaque. It was like trying to communicate across a gap so fundamental that even basic concepts didn't translate. On the 5th night, the non-reflecting moon was so close it filled a quarter of the sky, and its presence was no longer just visual. They could feel it now, a pressure in the air, a strange sensation like static electricity but more profound, as if reality itself was being compressed, squeezed between two worlds trying to occupy the same space. The reflected figures had changed as well, becoming more animated, more purposeful in their movements, gathering in the water's reflection as if preparing for something. Jennifer started experiencing symptoms that the others didn't have. She complained of vertigo, of feeling like she was in two places at once, of seeing double images that didn't quite line up. Amanda checked her vital signs, found nothing physically wrong, but Jennifer's distress was real and growing. Michael stayed close to her, holding her hand, and Sarah noticed that when Jennifer's symptoms were worst, the non-reflecting moon seemed to pulse or ripple, as if it were responding to her distress. David had a theory about this. He said that Jennifer might be more sensitive to the dimensional distortion than the others, that some people might naturally resonate more strongly with the frequency or vibration or whatever mechanism was at work here. If that was true, Jennifer might be the key to understanding what was happening, might be experiencing things the rest of them couldn't perceive. They gathered around Jennifer, asked her to describe what she was feeling, what she was seeing. She said it was like being pulled in two directions at once, like part of her wanted to stay here in the clearing but another part was being drawn. Toward the moon, toward the reflection, toward the figures waiting there. She said she could almost hear them. Not words exactly but intentions, feelings, a desperate need to communicate something important. Sarah asked what the figures were trying to communicate, and Jennifer closed her eyes, concentrated, tried to filter signal from noise in the overwhelming sensory input she was receiving. She said the figures were trapped, had been trapped for a very long time in their reflection world, a place that was adjacent to reality but separate from it, a prison or a quarantine or a protective boundary that had been established long ago for reasons no one remembered. The two moons, Jennifer said, weren't really moons at all. They were markers, indicators of the boundary between worlds. The reflecting moon showed them their reality, solid and comprehensible and following known laws. The non-reflecting moon was the other side of that boundary, the reality where the figures existed, and its approach wasn't an invasion but a breakdown, a failure of whatever mechanism had kept the two realities separate. Marcus asked why the boundary was failing, and Jennifer said it was because of them but not in the way they'd thought. It wasn't their movements that brought the moon closer. Not exactly. It was their presence, their consciousness, their observation of the phenomenon. The act of seeing the two moons, of recognizing that there were two realities, created a bridge between them, allowed them to interact in ways they weren't supposed to interact. The figures, Jennifer continued, weren't trying to break through or escape. They were trying to warn them, to tell them that the boundary needed to be restored before both realities collapsed into each other and destroyed everything. But the only way to restore the boundary was to forget, to stop seeing the two moons, to allow their consciousness to return to a state where there was only one reality, one moon, one truth. The group absorbed this information in stunned silence. David pointed out the obvious problem. You couldn't just decide to unsee something, couldn't force yourself to forget something you knew was true. The human brain didn't work that way. Once you'd perceived the impossible, once you'd witnessed something that shattered your understanding of reality, you couldn't go back to the innocent state of not knowing. But Robert had an idea. He said that in his military training, he'd learned techniques for dealing with traumatic memories, ways to compartmentalize and isolate experiences that were too overwhelming to process. What if they could do something similar here? Not forget exactly, but disconnect their emotional and intellectual engagement with what they were seeing, treat it as if it were a dream or hallucination, something their minds registered but didn't accept as real. Lisa objected that this sounded like willful self-delusion, choosing to ignore reality because it was too uncomfortable to accept. But Amanda pointed out that their current reality was impossible anyway, that normal rules clearly didn't apply here, so maybe the solution was equally impossible by normal standards. Maybe the way out of a illogical situation was through illogical means. They decided to try. Sitting in a circle around the fire, they attempted to achieve a state of collective meditation or dissociation, to acknowledge what they were seeing while simultaneously refusing to grant it reality in their minds. It was extraordinarily difficult, like trying to unsolve a puzzle or unknow a fact, like trying to see the famous optical illusion as just random lines after you'd already recognized the hidden image. Hours passed, the sixth night deepening toward dawn, and the non-reflecting moon hung so close now that it seemed like they could reach up and touch it, like its surface was just beyond the treetops, like at any moment it would descend the final distance and make contact with the ground. The reflected figures in the creek were perfectly clear now, solid and substantial, and Sarah could see that they looked almost exactly like humans, except for their eyes, which were too large, too dark, reflecting something other than the light around them. Jennifer was in the worst state, her sensitivity to the dimensional distortion making it almost impossible for her to function. Michael held her, whispered to her, tried to anchor her to this reality, but she kept slipping, kept saying she could see the other place, the reflection world where the figures lived, a place that was beautiful and terrible and completely alien to human experience. Then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't a sudden change, but gradual, like watching ice melt or paint dry, so slow you couldn't point to the exact moment when it happened. The pressure in the air eased slightly, the static electricity feeling diminished, and when Sarah looked up at the sky, the non-reflecting moon seemed fractionally smaller, fractionally farther away than it had been moments before. They were doing it. Somehow, through whatever mental gymnastics they were performing, through whatever collective will they were exerting, they were pushing the moon back, re-establishing the boundary between realities. David started crying, relief and exhaustion overwhelming his usual composed scientist demeanor. Marcus laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that suggested he wasn't entirely sure any of this was real. But the effort required was immense, unsustainable. They couldn't maintain this state indefinitely, couldn't hold this dissociated awareness for hours or days or however long it would take to fully restore the boundary. They needed something more permanent, something that would allow them to return to normal consciousness without immediately collapsing everything they'd achieved. Robert had been thinking about this, and he proposed something radical. He said that if their observation and belief in the two moons created the bridge between realities, then maybe they needed to create a different kind of belief, a different story that would overwrite what they'd experienced. They needed to convince themselves at a level deeper than rational thought that they'd never seen two moons, that they'd experienced something else, something explainable and consistent with normal reality. Amanda understood immediately. She said they needed to create a shared narrative, a collective false memory that would replace the true one, something their minds could accept that would allow them to disconnect from the impossible truth they'd witnessed. It would be a kind of therapeutic fiction, a story they told themselves and each other until it became more real than reality. They began constructing the narrative together, weaving a tale that explained their time in the forest without requiring two moons or dimensional barriers or figures in reflections. They'd come camping. They'd gotten lost when the trails proved more confusing than their maps suggested. They'd spent several frightening days trying to find their way back to the logging road. They'd dealt with fear and exhaustion and the natural disorientation that comes from being in deep wilderness without proper navigation tools. It was a boring story compared to the truth, mundane and explicable, but that was exactly what made it work. The human mind craved sense and order, wanted explanations that fit within established frameworks. The story of being lost in the woods was something everyone could understand and accept, something that didn't require breaking the laws of physics or accepting the existence of parallel realities. They told the story to each other over and over, adding details, making it richer and more believable with each repetition. They talked about specific moments of the fictional experience, about arguments they'd had about which direction to go, about the relief when Robert finally found landmarks he recognized, about the lesson learned about always staying on marked trails. They performed the story like a play, inhabited it like method actors, lived it until the distinction between performance and reality began to blur. Dawn broke on the 7th morning, and when the sun rose, there was only one moon setting in the western sky, the familiar moon that had hung in Earth's sky for billions of years, following its predictable orbit, reflecting perfectly in water, solid and real and singular. The clearing looked ordinary, just another camping spot in a normal forest, and when they packed up their gear and drove out, the logging road was exactly where it should have been, rough but passable, leading them back to civilization without incident. They drove in silence for a long time, each person processing what they'd experienced, or what they thought they'd experienced, or what they decided to believe they'd experienced. The story they'd constructed felt true in their minds, felt like something that had really happened, but there was a strange quality to the memories, a flatness or artificiality that suggested they were remembering something they'd created rather than something they'd lived through. Lisa's photographs told a different story. When she reviewed them later, back in the safety of her apartment, she found images of two moons, of reflected figures, of her friends staring up at an impossible sky. But even seeing the evidence, she found herself explaining it away, telling herself the images must be corrupted, double exposures, lens flares, something technical that created false images. The photographs disturbed her enough that she deleted them. All except one that she kept in a password-protected folder she tried very hard to never open. David's notebook contained pages of calculations and observations about the two-moon phenomenon, detailed measurements and theories about dimensional barriers and the relationship between consciousness and reality. But when he tried to read his own notes, found himself unable to concentrate on them, unable to engage with the content in any meaningful way. Eventually, he tore out those pages and burned them, telling himself he was just clearing out old work, making space for new research. Jennifer's sensitivity to the dimensional distortion left lasting effects. For weeks afterward, she experienced moments of dissociation, times when she felt like she was existing in two places simultaneously, when the world around her seemed less than fully solid. She saw therapists, tried medication, and eventually the symptoms faded, but she never quite lost the feeling that reality was thinner than most people believed, that there were cracks in the fabric of existence through which other things could be glimpsed. The group stayed in touch after the trip, but their friendship had a strange quality now, a careful avoidance of certain topics, a shared understanding that there were things they didn't discuss. When they got together, they'd sometimes start to mention something from the camping trip, then stop themselves, change the subject, steer the conversation toward safer territory. It was like they were all protecting each other from something, or protecting themselves from each other's memories. Sarah found herself doing research on folklore and mythology, reading about stories from cultures around the world that talked about places where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where people could slip between realities if they weren't careful. She found accounts of travelers who'd gotten lost in forests and emerged days or weeks later with no memory of where they'd been, or with strange stories about seeing impossible things that everyone dismissed as delusions or hallucinations. She wondered how many of those stories were true, how many people had stumbled into places like the clearing they'd found, had witnessed things they weren't supposed to witness, had been forced to choose between accepting an impossible truth or constructing a comfortable lie that allowed them to return to normal life. She wondered if the boundaries between realities failed regularly, if there were spots all over the world where the fabric of existence wore thin, and if most people who encountered these places simply chose to forget, chose to create false narratives that let them sleep at night. Marcus, the history teacher, found himself incorporating new material into his lessons, talking to his students about the difference between objective history and remembered history, about how communities and cultures construct narratives about their past that serve present needs, rather than accurately reflecting what actually happened. He talked about collective memory and social amnesia, about the stories societies tell themselves to make sense of trauma or discontinuity. His students found these lessons abstract and theoretical, but for Marcus, they were deeply personal, a way of processing something he couldn't quite remember but couldn't quite forget. Robert went back to his construction work and his children and his carefully compartmentalized life, but he found himself paying more attention to reflections. When he saw puddles after rain, when he passed mirrors, when water caught the light at certain angles, he'd find himself looking more closely than he used to, half expecting to see something that didn't belong, some echo of those figures they'd seen in the creek. He never did, or if he did, he immediately looked away, refused to acknowledge it, kept walking. Michael and Jennifer's relationship didn't survive the trip. They broke up 3 months later, citing the usual reasons couples give when they split. Grown apart, want different things, no one's fault really. But the truth was that they couldn't be together without being reminded of those days in the forest, without triggering whatever memories or non-memories lurked beneath the surface of their constructed narrative. Being apart was easier, safer, less likely to crack the careful fiction they'd built. Amanda continued her work as a social worker, continued dealing with people in crisis, but she found herself more empathetic to clients who told strange stories, who claimed to have experienced things that defied rational explanation. She didn't necessarily believe them, couldn't afford to believe them, couldn't let herself go down that path, but she understood the need to be heard, to have someone acknowledge that your experience, however strange, had been real for you. Years passed. The 8 of them moved on with their lives, pursued careers, formed new relationships, had experiences that gradually buried that September camping trip deeper in memory. They didn't talk about it, didn't think about it much, and when they did think about it, what they remembered was getting lost in the woods, being scared and disoriented, finally finding their way out. Just a normal camping misadventure, the kind of thing that happens to people all the time. But sometimes, on clear nights when the moon was full, one or another of them would find themselves looking up at the sky with a strange sense of unease, a feeling that something was missing or wrong or different than it should be. They'd stare at the single moon hanging there, perfect and solitary in the darkness, and feel an itch in their minds, a nagging sensation that they'd forgotten something important, that there was a question they should be asking but couldn't quite formulate. And in those moments, if they happened to be near water, if they happened to glance down at a reflection of the night sky, they'd see something that made them immediately look away, made them walk faster, made them hurry home and lock their doors and tell themselves they'd imagined it, that it was just a trick of light, that there was nothing there, there had never been anything there was only one moon and one reality and one truth. The forest still stood in the Pacific Northwest, vast and ancient and indifferent to human concerns. The clearing where 8 people had camped remained, though it was harder to find now, the trails around it even more confused and contradictory than they'd been. Rangers occasionally reported hikers who claimed to have gotten lost in that area, who emerged after days in the woods with strange stories they couldn't quite articulate, who seemed shaken in ways that simple disorientation didn't explain. The Ranger Service kept those reports in a file that they didn't talk about much, that they didn't include in official statistics, that they shared with new rangers as an informal warning to be careful which areas you recommended to visitors. The file went back decades, they discovered, full of similar reports of people who'd gone into the deep forest and come back changed, who'd seen things or experienced things or forgotten things in ways that suggested the forest held secrets older and stranger than anyone wanted to acknowledge. There were patterns in the reports if you looked for them, cycles that corresponded with lunar phases or seasonal changes or who knows what other variables. Times when the boundaries seemed thinner, when more people got lost or had strange experiences or came back telling stories about 2 moons in the sky. The rangers learned to watch for these periods, to be extra careful about which permits they issued, to quietly discourage people from going too deep into certain sections during certain times of year. But they couldn't close the forest, couldn't prevent everyone from visiting, couldn't protect people from something they didn't fully understand. And so the stories continued, generation after generation, a constant low background frequency of strangeness that most people dismissed as hallucination or panic or the natural disorientation of being lost in wilderness. Sarah, now 42 years old, successful in her career, in a new relationship that made her happy, found herself planning another camping trip. Not to that forest. She avoided the Pacific Northwest entirely, couldn't quite explain why, but to the mountains of Colorado, to a well-marked trail system where getting lost would be almost impossible. She invited friends, organized the logistics, packed gear with the same efficiency she'd learned years ago. The night before the trip, she had a dream. She was standing in a clearing in a forest, looking up at a sky that held 2 moons, one that reflected perfectly in water and one that didn't, and there were figures standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her, waiting for something. In the dream, she understood what they were waiting for, understood the choice she'd made, understood that the price of that choice was eternal vigilance, eternal denial, eternal refusal to acknowledge what she knew was true. She woke up gasping, her heart pounding, and for a moment, the dream felt more real than her bedroom, more true than the life she'd constructed in the 8 years since that September trip. But then her partner stirred beside her, asked if she was okay, and the moment passed. She said it was just a bad dream, nothing important, already fading from memory. In the morning, she canceled the camping trip, told her friends something had come up at work, a crisis that required her attention, and while she felt bad about the last-minute cancellation, felt worse about lying. She knew she couldn't go camping, not now, not ever again. It was too dangerous, too likely to trigger something she'd worked very hard to bury, too close to edges she couldn't afford to approach. Her friends understood or said they did, and the trip was rescheduled without her. Sarah stayed home that weekend, stayed inside, avoided looking at the sky, especially avoided looking at reflections in water. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that her fear was irrational, that she was letting an old memory of getting lost in the woods years ago control her present behavior in ways that didn't make sense. But deep down, In a place she tried very hard not to examine. She knew the truth. She knew there were two moons, had always been two moons, would always be two moons for as long as humans looked up at the night sky. Most people only saw one because that was all they needed to see, all they could handle seeing, all that was safe to see. But the other moon was there, patient and eternal, waiting in its reflection world for the moment when the boundaries would fail again, when consciousness and observation would once more bridge the gap between realities. And when that happened, when someone else stumbled into a place where the boundaries were thin, when another group of campers looked up at an impossible sky and saw what they weren't supposed to see, they would face the same choice Sarah's group had faced. Accept the impossible truth and risk everything, or construct a comfortable lie and live with the nagging sense that reality was less certain than everyone pretended it was. Sarah lived with that choice every day, lived with the weight of choosing survival over truth, sanity over knowledge. She lived with the dreams that occasionally broke through her carefully constructed defenses, with the moments of dissociation when the world seemed less than fully solid, with the constant low-level anxiety that came from knowing there were things in the dark that shouldn't be acknowledged because acknowledging them gave them power. But she also lived with love and friendship and meaningful work and all the ordinary joys that make human life worth living. She laughed with her partner, excelled in her career, helped her friends through their crises, and found beauty in small moments of daily existence. The price of that life was forgetting or pretending to forget, and most days the price seemed worth paying. The moon rose that night as it rose every night, singular and constant in the darkness, following its eternal orbit around the earth, reflecting perfectly in every body of water on the planet's surface. People looked up at it and saw beauty, saw romance, saw the reminder that even in chaos and confusion, some things remained reliable and true. They didn't see the second moon, the one that existed in reflection space, that moved when they moved, that drew closer when they acknowledged it. They didn't see the figures watching from the other side of the boundary, learning and waiting and preparing for the next time the barrier would fail. They didn't see any of it because they didn't need to see it, because their minds protected them from truths too large and strange to process. But the second moon was there, had always been there, hanging in a sky that most people never looked at closely enough to notice its presence. And every night, imperceptibly, it moved closer to some people and farther from others, responding to consciousness and belief and the strange quantum connection between observation and reality. Sarah stood at her window that night, looking out at the ordinary moon in the ordinary sky, and felt the familiar itch in her mind, the sense that she was forgetting something important. She ignored it as she'd learned to ignore it, turned away from the window, went back to bed. Tomorrow would be another day of careful forgetting, another day of choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. And that was enough. That had to be enough. Because the alternative, remembering fully, acknowledging completely, accepting the reality of the two moons and the thin places between worlds, that way lay madness or transformation or something for which humans didn't yet have words. So she slept, and dreamed of forests and reflections and moons that moved when you moved, and in the morning, she woke up and forgot the dreams and went about her day, living the life she'd chosen, the life that required forgetting, the life that was purchased with deliberate blindness to truths too strange to acknowledge. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, in a clearing that was hard to find and harder to leave, the forest waited for the next visitors who would look up at the wrong moment and see what they weren't supposed to see. The forest was patient. The forest had time. The forest had been there for thousands of years and would be there for thousands more, guarding its secrets, maintaining its boundaries, occasionally allowing humans to glimpse the impossible before gently, firmly, encouraging them to forget. Because some knowledge came with too high a price. Some truths changed you in ways you couldn't undo. Some things, once seen, could never be unseen, and the only defense against that kind of truth was the carefully maintained fiction that it had never happened, that you had never seen it, that there had only ever been one moon in the sky. And for most people, most of the time, that fiction held. Reality remained solid and sensible and comprehensible. The boundaries stayed intact. The two worlds remained separate, connected only by the thin membrane of water's reflection, only visible to those who looked too closely at what should remain unexamined. But the boundaries were always there, always thin in certain places, always ready to fail again when consciousness and curiosity and observation created bridges where no bridges should exist. And when they did fail, when someone else saw what Sarah and her friends had seen, the cycle would repeat, and new choices would have to be made, and new fictions would have to be constructed. Because that was the price of living in a universe more strange and vast and multidimensional than human minds were designed to comprehend. Sometimes, the only way to survive was to choose not to understand, to deliberately blind yourself to truths that would shatter you if you acknowledged them fully. And in the end, that might be the greatest mercy the universe offered, the ability to forget, to unsee, to construct comfortable lies that allowed life to continue in the face of impossible knowledge. Sarah and her friends had accepted that mercy, had chosen survival over truth, and they lived with the consequences of that choice every day. Whether they'd made the right choice, whether there even was a right choice in a situation like that, was a question they couldn't afford to ask. Because asking questions led to seeking answers, and seeking answers led to looking too closely at reflections, and looking too closely at reflections revealed the truth about the two moons and the figures that watched and waited from the other side of reality. So they didn't ask. They didn't seek. They didn't look. They lived their lives with deliberate blindness, protecting themselves and each other from knowledge that would undo everything they'd built in the years since that September camping trip. And maybe that was enough. Maybe surviving was enough. Maybe choosing life, even life built on comfortable lies, was better than the alternative. Or maybe they were just postponing the inevitable. Maybe the boundaries would fail again. Maybe one day they'd be forced to confront what they'd spent years trying to forget. But for now, tonight, they slept peacefully under a sky with one moon, and dreamed dreams they wouldn't remember in the morning, and woke to face another day of careful forgetting. Another day of living in a world they'd chosen to see as simpler than it really was. If you've enjoyed this story and found yourself drawn into the mystery of the forest with two moons, make sure to subscribe to Real Conflict Zone for more stories that explore the boundaries between reality and the impossible. We delve into tales of survival, mystery, and the extraordinary experiences that challenge everything we think we know about the world around us. Write down your suggestions in the comment box about what types of stories you'd like to hear next. Do you want more cosmic horror? More wilderness mysteries? More stories about the places where reality grows thin? Let us know, and we'll bring you the stories that keep you listening until the very end. Until next time, take care, watch the reflections carefully, and remember that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you choose not to see. Goodbye for now.